much, Guillermo, for a very elaborate introduction. It's very kind and humbling. Thank you. So yeah, good afternoon to everyone who is there online or in person. And today, what I'm going to do is to talk about how teams of aerial robots can jointly perceive their environment, coordinate their motion, and autonomously accomplish tasks in complex real-world setting. Yeah. And broadly, in the first part of my talk, I will cover methods, some methods for perception control, formation control. And in the second part, I'm going to present a use case for these methods where I will talk about one of our flagship projects in the group. Okay, so let us start with this motivating scenario, right? So here we see a team of drones that we built ourselves that are flying autonomously as a team and following a moving person in an unstructured outdoor environment. So, and all the sensing and computation on that is happening here is on board the drone. So every drone has a computational unit, sensors, and so on, and everything is happening on the robots. They're communicating with each other, of course, through a base station, but the idea is that they are fully self-contained and fully autonomous. Now, in order to achieve this, what we have to answer, there are some fundamental questions that we need to answer, right? And so, which means, which I have enumerated here for your ease also to read, but I will elaborate a little bit on them. So, how can multiple drones perceive the environment? Or the subjects moving in the environment cooperatively, so that they have some kind of consistent and joint, mutually consistent estimate of this of the environment. And then how can they fuse their observations? So each of these drones are making some kind of observations using their own sensors, etc. And how can they fuse these observations into an estimate of, let's say, a moving target and so on. And then finally, how should they move as a team? Once they have the estimates, once they can know exactly where and consistently, so agree on or have a consensus, how they can act upon it, right? So how can they move themselves as a team so that their viewpoints remain informative, right? And the target stays observable as long as possible. So now I'll talk about the methods, basically how we achieve this, right? So the first thing that we develop are basically two tightly coupled methods, right? The first is for multi-UAV cooperative perception, where the objective is to basically jointly estimate the subject's position and track it as the subject moves in the environment, right? And this can be extended to various more complex parts of the state, like not just the position, but the pose, full body pose, articulated pose, and so on. And now the second objective is for the active multi-UAV formation control, right? So where the objective is to plan the paths of the UAVs, so as a team, so that there is some optimality in tracking the subject, right? Now, let us try to go a little bit into details, or as much as possible, into the details of each of these two methods that I highlighted now first. So the first is multi-UAV cooperative perception, right? So the perception of the environment, when we talk about here, will generally include estimating the map of the environment, right? In addition to estimating the position of dynamic objects like moving humans. But in the method that I'm going to describe further in several slides, we will focus on a single moving target. And then in order to develop a rather generalized method, we will also assume that there are no specific markers on the sensors or sensors on the body of the person, right? So then each drone, we will assume, so for a case of, to make it, let's say, more complex, more tough, the problem, we will also assume that a single RGB camera, vision camera, is what every drone has. And also it is rigidly mounted on the drone. So we can all keep on relaxing this or generalizing this, having multiple cameras and so on later on. And also could have a gimbal to make it more easier. But we can explain the method with a rigidly mounted camera on the drone. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Yeah. Now, let's say with these boundary conditions, we set the problem. We formulate the problem of multi-UAV cooperative perception, and it will boil down to this. Now, each drone has the access to its own image stream, right? So what you see in the picture here. And they can communicate with the other drones, right? And the objective remains to estimate the 3D position of the target as it moves, along with an uncertainty associated with this 3D position, right? So this is first time I'm introducing the word uncertainty in the estimate also. So what you see on the right side is basically the result, the final result that we want at the end of this method, which is not only the position, but also some kind of uncertainty ellipse associated with this. Yeah. And then the method I'll describe further will answer this question of how drones will infer these only from the images that they acquire. Okay, so in describing the method, my approach today will be to highlight a few challenges, right? And that I will say now, and then the method will step by step, one by one, address these challenges. So the first challenge is that of the sensor and its measurements. The sensor is an RGB camera that produces images. So the question is, what kind of information can be extracted from monocular RGB cameras and used as a measurement for estimating the 3D position of the subject in the world frame, keep it that in mind, and the associated uncertainty. The second challenge is then how to then coherently fuse this information from multiple simultaneously acquired images from cameras mounted on different platforms. Then all this, that leads to the third challenge, all this needs to be done under communication and computation constraints since UAVs are generally limited in payload, right? So therefore, when carrying small computers or GPU, like in our case, we have been using TX1 since we started the project, and if they are deployed in unstructured, unknown environment, right? So the communication infrastructure may also be limited. So our method that I'm going to explain here is basically going to handle each of these challenges step by step. Okay, so the first step in the method is basically to perform detections, right? So let's start small. Let's begin with a very simple approach and say the idea is to obtain what the 2D pixel position of the person in the image, or more generally a bounding box around the person in the image, right? And this is essentially the 2D measurement that we need and which is to be used later to obtain the 3D pose estimate. Now, how can we do this? Today is very common. We can obtain this 2D bounding box using a state-of-the-art neural network-based detector, right? Like SSD multibox or Euro. But here comes already the first, let's say, question that we answer here. Such DNN-based detector or whatever comes with only a bounding box, and which is the position, and a confidence score. This is great, but this does not immediately help us in estimating what I was talking about in terms of uncertainty. We'll see that in a moment how we will achieve that. Now, what I was saying is this DNN-based detector does not produce the so-called noise associated with these 2D measurements, right? So, and if we don't have this measure of this noise, then we cannot estimate the uncertainty in the 3D position estimate. Therefore, this step of our method, what we are going to do is to perform separately, so not like in a real-time estimation, but separately, we perform noise quantification of this sensor. And that is a very essential step here. To do this, what we did was to create an extended evaluation set for the detector by augmenting it with images that contain, for example, upscaled and downscaled images of the detected person, making the person smaller, distant, larger, and so on. And then after running detections on this augmented set, we then perform statistical analysis to quantify the noise in the 2D pixel error, which for our detector, we could approximate as zero mean Gaussian and associated covariances. So these covariances or covariance as a function of the state, etc. This is basically the noise quantification that we need in order to use this detector as a measurement in the full estimator. And then when we were doing this, we also did some additional statistical analysis, right? So the additional statistical analysis here was basically, as a byproduct, it was done to, for example, infer that the projected height of the person in the image must remain as a certain ratio of the total size of the actual height of the image. Only then the detector was actually giving a correct detection or a positive detection of the person. And we found out, for example, in this scenario, this ratio should be around 0.3 for the detector to provide reliable detections. And this kind of insight, this kind of understanding also became later useful, as you will see in a moment. Okay, let's go to the next step. What's happening there? So here, once we have the detection, the next step is the method is going to address the challenge of fusion and at the same time address the question of communication constraints, right? So here, what we are going to do is to first convert these 2D pixel measurements that we had and its associated noise into a 3D measurement and corresponding noise covariance, right? So this is from 2D image space to a 3D space, which a frame which is attached to the drone, attached to the UAV, and so on. And this can be approximated with some mean and variance for an upright moving person, right? So here the variance of this can also be adapted by varying human poses. However, the insight here is that even though the assumption sounds like a limitation, right? So there is an assumption on the human height that it is in a certain range. What happens is the fact that these measurements are going to be fused from multiple UAVs and more than two actually. The height range assumption, so the height of the human is between so and so, there's a Gaussian distribution around it, some mean. Now, this has very small impact on the actual estimation because the more implicitly, if you can think of it, it's some kind of triangulation is happening and you're adding more measurements from multiple UAVs. You basically, the impact of this assumption becomes smaller and smaller. And then what we do is that instead of sharing the images, what we are sharing between these UAVs are these 3D detection measurements and the noise covariances, along with UAV self-pose estimates and the covariances of those estimates with other UAVs, right? So these are small floats, not many floats. So the data that is basically shared between the UAVs is extremely small, and we can do this typically with almost negligible delay. Okay, so this addresses the question of how do we fuse and how do we address the communication limitation. Now, what happens next? So at each UAV, then we basically create an extended Kalman filter, so a Kalman filter based tracker that uses the UAV's own measurements of the target and the measurements it receives from the UAVs converted into the world frame using self-pose and the uncertainties and so on. This way, we can account for uncertainties in each of the observer of the measurement producer. So all the UAVs are some kind of measurement producer, and all these uncertainties are basically then fused. Now, the output of the EKF here is then the 3D position estimate of the person in the world frame. Now, looks like we already solved this perception problem here, right? Like EKF is there, we have an estimate, and why not? And this also, half of it also looks like pretty much a standard Kalman filter. But there is yet another challenge here that needs to be addressed, although we addressed other challenges before, but one of them is remaining, which is the DNN-based detector is computationally heavy, right? So, I mean, okay, today you have even faster networks, but at the time, like when we started doing this project, the DNN running on a Jetson TX1 using a high resolution image, we could easily take up to 2 seconds or even more. Probably today also takes quite a lot of I mean, at least 200, 300 milliseconds and so on. So the question is, if this happens, we would have very delayed measurements, right? And this could lead to the failure in accurately tracking the person. How can we address this, right? So there comes our next insight, which is we can go back to the estimator's prediction step, right? So this was something that we already, probably people are familiar with the EKF or any Bayesian filter has this prediction step and the update step and so on. And this prediction step basically tells you what is the next likely state is basically along with an uncertainty. And that is what we are going to exploit here. That's what we do. And use it to compute basically the most informative region of interest in the future time step. And then this region of interest, which the most informative containing most information, being much smaller than the whole image. So of course, this is typically if you have a good estimate to begin with, this region of interest becomes smaller and smaller. And now can be processed much faster. This can be processed much faster by the same DNN. Instead of processing the full image, we process this region of interest. And we'll see later, this allowed us to track the person accurately in real time. Now, this active region of interest selection, so there is an action being performed, which is to select the region of interest implicitly. And then remember that we also previously had this statistical analysis done, which said that the person's height has to be a certain ratio of the size of the image that is being processed by the DNN. Only then we get a reliable detection. And so this active region of interest selection also allows us to maintain that, right? So instead of having a small person in a big image, which the DNN will then not detect or have very poor detection, that problem is also solved, right? So this active region of interest selections ensures basically that we have the sufficient ratio, and also this is done, detections are done very fast. This active region of interest selection is then the last step of our method. The output of this basically goes back to the detector, and then we restart with the first step of the detection. Okay, so yeah, I hope people are still awake and still following what I've been talking about. And so some video now, right? So let's move to this first simulation results. Talk about here using Gazebo. This video has already aged a little bit, but I think it is also important for the master students to see how these things have been developing over the last several years. So that's why I already also put this here. What you see here is essentially a team of 8 UAVs, right? Which you see in the middle of the screen. Maybe I think, I don't know if I can play again, but you understand from the image also what I want to explain. So you see 8 UAVs cooperatively tracking a person in a simulated Gazebo environment. And on the leftmost side, we see the different views of each of these cameras, right? And what the camera is seeing, how it is basically detecting. So the detections are these orange boxes. And on them, we also back project what is the actual final estimate back projected into 2D to see how good, at least visually, you can see how good the tracking was finally performed. On the right side is the simulation environment or the Gazebo. And in the middle, what we see is a 3D view of the UAV self-pose estimates, which you see up over here. I don't know if you see my mouse, probably not. And what we see also is the detection measurements with their noise covariances, and also the final estimate of which in this picture you don't see, but it's finally the orange ellipse at the end. What you also see in the bottom is kind of comparison of the ground truth, right? So the person is moving, and it's an articulated person moving in the environment, and what you see is the position of these bounding, a 3D bounding box of the person, so the X and the Y, compared with what we estimated as an X and Y in green and red. So I think green is what we did. So what's the ground truth, and red is what the estimate we did. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on and see what results this produces, what statistical results are there. So, right. So the video I showed was with 8 because more UAVs, then the whole video becomes more cluttered. But the experiment results that I show here is of 16 UAVs flying in simulation and doing this cooperative perception. And we also try to have some delay logic in the DNN-based detection to mimic the TX1 that will finally go on the actual hardware. And what we plot here is the estimation errors in both the track target state and the self-pose estimate of the UAV. So they are in blue and purple uh, on the left side here. And what is clear here is that the biggest improvement is coming from jumping from one UAV to two UAVs. That's also clear, right? For the one UAV, we had much more assumption on the range, height range of the person and so on, which kind of is already addressed by having two UAVs. And as we increase the number of UAVs, there is a progressive increase in the accuracy, but up to 4 or 5 UAVs. And then after that, what you see is a relatively small improvement. And these kind of findings through simulation also is important, because then when we are in real application domain or in some use cases, these findings become useful, as we will see maybe later today towards the end of the lecture. Okay, so and on the right side, what we also show is the region of interest, so the impact of the region of interest selection. So what we were doing was active ROI selection, and the blue plot indicates that our method with ROI selection is very good compared to with the yellow one, which is without, right? And this basically the estimation error increases substantially if not using the active ROI. Because there will be, of course, many misdetections due to the large size of the image, and the DNN had too much time to process, took too much time to process it. Okay, so yeah, let's put it all together, the method so far, basically, on real robots and see how did it perform. I don't know if people have seen this video before from some of my other talks, but this is essentially one of my favorite videos because this was one of the first successful let's say, results of the project of AirCap, where human motion capture from aerial robots was one of the first times done in some group, as far as I know. And so, yeah, anyway, so this video is a collage of, the same simulation results that you saw before, but now with the real images of the real UAVs, what's happening in the real environment on the right-hand side. And in the middle, you have the RViz view of where the drones are, where the measurements are, the uncertainties, and the fused target states, uncertainty and position. So the mean and the covariance. And for the ground truth, in this case, basically, we don't like to call it ground truth. It's more like a reference. For that, we had this MLID reach differential GPS modules placed on different drones, all the drones, and also on the person. That kind of gives the position of the person, the position of the drones. And then we had to manually align the reference frame of this MLID reach and the UAVs at the beginning of the experiment to then later on basically get an idea of comparison with the reference, or if you want to call it comparison with the ground truth, right? And what you see here is the person initially standing in place and then walks around and in the field. And the UAVs follow it by simply maintaining a certain distance and avoiding collisions with respect to each other. But then we show here how accurately we can track the position of the person in the 3D coordinates. Okay, so this brings me to the next results of this, basically, right? So we performed, what you saw was one of the experiments, one of the several experiments, and here are the results of basically two separate flight missions at different times of the day. And the plot here are basically about the self-pose errors of the UAVs in these pattern boxes, and the offline run of the whole simulation pipeline on single UAVs, because we also want to compare it. And that is in blue and magenta box to create this creates basically a sort of baseline on which we can basically show what we can achieve by each individual UAVs if it could process all the images, right? So of course this was not done by online, because online only at certain frame rate the images were being processed. But offline you can do it using the bags that were collected, right? So, and in blue is boxes basically is our full cooperative perception approach, and in basically also in yellow, right? So then these results are highlighting that our method improves the accuracy of the tracked person estimate through cooperative perception. Right, and it should also be noted that the self-pose accuracy of the drones also obviously affect the accuracy of the tracked person's estimate, which is also clear because you see the so one of the UAVs is less accurately localized than the other, and this further impacts the estimate by each of these UAVs. Okay, so let's move on to the second component, and I hope I'm keeping the track of time correctly. Yeah. Yeah, so the second component of the second method that I want to talk about is basically active multi-UAV formation control. So the first part was all about perceiving. You have measurements, you perceive the target, you have the target state estimate, and now we go, what do we do with this, right? What do we do with this perception? What are the actions the drone is going to take? So here, what I will describe is the method within the same general setup, right? And that we talked about before for the cooperative perception, that UAVs are there with onboard cameras and compute basically position of a human in an outdoor an unstructured environment, no sensors, no infrastructure, artificial infrastructure in the environment. Okay, so let's begin this method now. And the perception method enabled us to get this 3D position. As you saw on the the right side image on the slide, some slides ago, is now on the left side, right? So now we have the 3D position estimate of the person and the uncertainty. And now the question we ask is, how should these robots move or plan their paths to follow that person? And let's make it even more interesting to say how to follow the person such that the person is never out of the field of view, which is, of course, you want when you're doing such a mission. And that also the estimated position of the person is optimal in some sense, right? So this is the question our method is going to answer. Okay, so again, I will follow the same structure and I'll talk about some challenges, right? So the formation control method that effectively handles this whole thing handles some of these challenges step by step. And first, so these challenges are first that we need to mathematically model the joint uncertainty in the track target estimate by multiple UAVs so that we can have a model of what is good, what is not good, right? And then we will use this mathematical model to solve for UV trajectories. And when we do that, we will encounter things like non-convexities, non-linearities, whatever, and that we need to handle. So this is another challenge. And then again, all this needs to be done within the same computation and communication constraints. So yeah, these are the challenges that the method is going to handle. How do we do that? Okay, so again, the first step will handle some challenges. So the first step here is that we will derive the model for joint uncertainty. And joint uncertainty is to model uncertainty observation jointly from multiple drones. But the first step will be to derive the model for uncertainty from a single UAV, right? So we'll consider our scenario where each UAV employs the DNN-based detection which you saw before, and based on which we are going to get a range, bearing, and azimuth angle measurement of the target for the 3D measurement in a spherical coordinate system attached to the drone. Now, to model this uncertainty or the noise in these measurements, what we did was a similar process as before for the images, but now we run these detections in a simulation, right? So we have the simulated environment with humans and with drones and so on. So we can run these detections in simulation for a very large number of samples and perform noise quantification, and then approximate it as a function of the state variables, like function of the position of the UAV and so on. And it turns out that we can get a model that has a variance in the radial direction, which is towards the target, is proportional to the square of the radial distance to the target from the UAV. And in the bearing and azimuth angles, the variance is approximately constant. So what next? After that, we need to perform conversions, right? So this is an important step here, which must always be remembered, that we were in spherical coordinates, and now we eventually will be dealing with the Cartesian coordinates, so we need to perform this frame conversion. Now the measurements we made and its covariances were living in the spherical coordinate system, but the transformation from spherical to the Cartesian is nonlinear. And therefore, the conversion is not going to be straightforward anymore. In fact, now what you see here is the variances when we convert this into the Cartesian space, as you can do with the expected value and so on with that formula. And you'll see because of the nonlinearity, but the expression for the variances that you will get in the Cartesian space now becomes a function of all state variables, not just the radial distance, but the radial distance, the azimuth, the bearing embedded inside these exponential and trigonometric functions, right? So the question is, how do we deal with this? Ideally, you should propagate this all along. But then for certain scenarios or for certain applications or for certain basically situations, we can look for some insights. So how to simplify this, right? And this is what we do in the next step. So we look for some insights into the physical scenario of our system and our task. So our task, what was the task? To enforce the UAVs to almost keep them oriented towards the target, right? So keeping them in the center of the view and so on. What will this imply? This implies that the bearing angle measurement is almost always close to zero, right? So in a steady state scenario of the formation control, we will the drones will always look towards the target, right? And second, when we observe that in the transient phase of the target, that is from the formation has converged to the sorry the steady state, the formation has converged to the target and starts following it, the inclination angle measurement also remains approximately constant, especially if you fix the, which was our case, which is we fix the camera angle, we fix the camera with rigidly to the drone. And it turns out that since we mounted this with 45 degrees pointing towards the horizontal frame of the UAV, the bearing angle is almost always pi by 2. This can be another angle, but that's basically our insight here. And then when we apply this to the converted Cartesian frame covariances, we then have some manageable expression for the variances in x and y, and the cross covariances basically vanish. Okay, so let's move on and see what do we do next with this when we have a single UAV observation model. We have to move towards the obtaining the joint UAV, joint perception model from for multiple UAVs. And a key concern in obtaining the joint covariance model in the literature also is regarding the geometrical configuration of the observers that optimize certain criteria, right? So here we will not start anything from scratch again. And we will build upon such works in the literature that determine what are the optimal sensor geometries by maximizing, which we achieve basically by maximizing the determinant of the joint Fisher information matrix when doing such tracking. Right, and then by applying those let's say criteria, in our case, the optimal geometry is when what you see in this picture here is when the UAVs are 2 pi by k spread around the target, where well, let's just say k, where k is the number of the robots or the UAVs. For k greater than 3, for k for equals 2, it actually turns out to be 90 degrees. With respect to the target, and the uncertainty for each of these UAV. So the criteria that it boils down to this the optimal geometry of the angles around the target, and also separately the uncertainty of each UAV is minimum. So both of these conditions need to satisfy. And so the first condition then translates to an angular constraint criteria, while the second one will be converted into a distance criteria to the target. And these become part of our optimization problem, as you will see in a moment. Yeah, so one more thing which I want to emphasize here is to remember these constraints. So angular constraints are then a function of the number of robots in the formation, and the distance objective is a function of like each individual UAV's distance, right? So depending on the knowledge of how many drones there are, this becomes like a kind of a pre-information for this formation controller. If the formation needs to know how many drones are active at a certain time in a given mission. So now that we have this mathematical model for optimal perception that we just talked about, we will use it to formulate a model predictive control problem, right, to solve for the UAV trajectories. And what we do here is the cost function is going to embed the distance to the target criteria. It is a quadratic cost. And a control effort minimization objective, which is standard. So you don't want jitters or so on in your UAV. And the idea in this MPC is to model the UAV as a linear system, and the dynamics are one of the constraints. So the linear system dynamics, and the other constraints are the limits of the state and control actions and so on. And the output of the MPC is basically then the trajectory of the waypoints and velocities that are then provided as a reference to the low-level waypoint controller, right? So a faster inner loop controller can then even, I mean, for a multi-rotor drone, it is you can achieve a much faster inner loop control. So this approximation actually is still achieves this kind of formation in quite easily. Now, you'll see that this is not typically valid for other kinds of vehicles. I'll mention that later in some later slide. Yeah, and so what we also should mention that the yaw control task here is to orient the direction of the target, which we do separately, right? Okay, so now that is done. here I want you to recall, I mean, you can ask me a question later on. I don't know what's the procedure. If you want to interrupt me, it's also okay sometime, but perhaps it's better to ask questions later about some of these notations. But I'm giving an overview, some kind of overview where you don't have to understand immediately all these variables. Just focus on what I'm talking about, and you'll get the gist of what these expressions are doing. So remember, we developed a mathematical model for the joint covariance that resulted into two conditions. One of them we still need to talk about, right, which is the angular constraint. So in the previous one, we only talked about the distance constraint, which is in the cost function. But now the angular constraints also need to show up, right? So somewhere. And at the same time, we also should not forget that we have this issue that we are flying with drones, in multiple drones in an environment with obstacles and so on. So there is a good chance that things might collide, and it's not nice. So we need to have safe formation control, right? So we need to talk about and take into account the collision as a criteria. Now, these need to show up as constraints in MPC formulation, also for many other reasons, but also you want to really ensure that there is no collision and not like a soft constraint coming up as an objective. Now, and a common aspect for this kind of constraint and the angular constraint that the robots must maintain an angular configuration. These are basically going to impose non-convexity. So one of the challenges that I mentioned briefly before. So they impose non-convexities in the MPC, which is not good, right? So the is a much bigger problem than nonlinearity, which is non-convexity. Yeah. And based on another like work that we have done before, which I don't want to go into detail today, we address this problem of like how to still work with non-convex situations and constraints by converting them into a force value, right? And using some potential function, then converting into force value, we embed them directly into the linear system dynamics constraint, which is this expression here over in the first constraint of the MPC. But although we do locally convexify this problem, MPC can handle it. It does not remove all associated other problems like field local minima. So what it solves is that the MPC can immediately produce results, which is good to move to the next iteration, but the field local minima might appear. But then in this paper, we also showed that there are several heuristics which we can use by observing what is the gradient of the function of the objective function and so on, to detect these field local minimas, and then we can come out of these field local minimas again by applying some external force in the same constraint, linear dynamics constraint. Okay, so yeah, let's, I think went too much in detail now, but let's try to summarize very quickly of what we did now for this second method. So a formation controller is a convex MPC that now outputs UAV trajectories while actively minimizing the joint target uncertainty and enabling collision avoidance. And this runs on board and online on all UAVs. Okay. This kind of wraps up both the formation controller and the cooperative perception module, and we can put them together in an architecture that you see here. And the perception module that we discussed earlier is basically the green module here, and the blue one is what we just talked about. Each of these is run as an instance on each UAV, and they take in self-pose, target measurements, and so on, as was described in the method before. Let's see what are the results, right? So in a simulation environment, we see some interesting results that basically are in the same gazebo environment, but instead as opposed to the last time, we also now introduce some trees over here, which basically are known obstacles in the environment which the drones have to avoid. And what you see in the middle on the left side over here is basically the drones, the trajectories, the MPC predicted trajectories that the drones then decide to follow and try to maintain this formation to optimally track the target, which is moving in the on the ground. Yeah, so what are some statistical results of this kind of experiments? We performed several experiments, don't exactly remember the number now, but several hundreds of these simulation experiments for several minutes. And these are some results of those, right, cumulatively. So the key takeaway is that our full approach results in the best accuracy compared to baselines where either active tracking was not enabled or collision avoidance was not as embedded as a convex constraint. And we also show that the static obstacles then increased so the more static obstacles there is more error in the tracking, which is expected. Now we also note how this uncertainty remains minimum for our method compared to the baseline, which you see in the figure B. And in addition to this, our method also is ensuring a very high percentage of person's visibility, right, and a closeness to the image center, which you see all in the green plots over here. Okay, yeah, we performed actually many more experiments here by adding static obstacles and so on. And we see that the degradation in the track target estimate is not very highly pronounced, right? So this is because at least a few robots in the formation always manage to keep the target always in the field of view. And as we have also seen previously, this increase in the number of robots beyond a certain number also does not provide any significant improvement in the track state estimate, right? So this kind of is a consistent outcome which we see here. Okay, and this outcome basically is also highlighted again on this plot on the left side, where we see we increase the number of UAVs. We see the jump in the or the increase in the accuracy, decrease in the error is high when in the lower number of UAVs, and it gets basically saturated as we increase the number of UAVs. We also performed some experiments to test communication failure and observed that the method is robust to a high degree of packet loss, as you see on the right side. Okay, let's put this all together and watch the performance of these drones doing both cooperative perception, which was active at the level of region of interest selection, and now active at the level of finding or computing what are the best pathways as a formation to take in order to track the person. And you see here, so in the real environment, of course, we did not risk having an obstacle. So we were typically flying in an open environment and for all of our real experiments. But here we had virtual obstacles. So you see these red pillars are these obstacles that we just project here, but this is also given to the UAVs that in the world frame, these are the obstacles and I need to avoid them and basically to test if the whole method with obstacle avoidance also works. Also to emphasize that our drones did not have any sensing for obstacles. So there is no collision sensor or obstacle sensor that could be then used for avoiding collisions. So these virtual obstacles were pre-programmed. Yeah. And in these experiments, we also show that the person could be changing the pose arbitrary, which did not significantly impact how the position of the person was estimated, and therefore the formation was also quite stable around the person. Okay, so let's move on, and I think of 45 minutes. Okay, I'm good and halfway in the lecture. I think this is according to what I planned. And so finally, a brief comment on the real robot results corresponding closely to the simulation results that we highlighted before. And basically, the idea is that our method, or the result is that our method keeps the person always visible, close to the image center, and with the least uncertainty compared to other baselines. So as a next step, what do we want to do? We want to go to a more unstructured environment, even more unstructured environment, like what you see in the picture here. So we went ahead to Lisbon in Urban Search and Rescue School, where we had some collaborations during my PhD time. Also we had some collaborations. So building upon that, we took our drones from Tübingen. So every experiment that you saw before was performed in Tübingen, in Germany, and then we took our drones there, together with the firefighters to figure out what are the different problems that we can address using the methods and systems that we are developing. And as you see, some of our methods working here in the real scenario. So these blue marks are basically post annotations to show where the drones are. These are not the overlays of the robot's estimate, because this video was then taken by a completely different row. But this highlights several things, like not only our methods were quite robust and in keeping the person in the field of view, avoiding obstacles. So here you don't see a good 90-degree formation, especially because there are many obstacles in the environment, like poles and so on, which we had to pre-program, and the robot had to avoid them while doing these tracking and following experiment. But then these kind of missions and these kind of real world experiences led us to basically think of what are the next bigger challenges that we can address using our methods, and what are the new challenges, and for those challenges develop new methods, right? So it's iterative process in my opinion. So therefore, enter Project Wildcat, right? So after all these experiences, we started talking about, okay, not only is it interesting to track humans, which we have been doing before, but also when we saw firefighters with rescue dogs, and the idea came, okay, why can't we also track animals? They bring new challenges. Dogs already brought new challenges over there, which was they move extremely fast. So a standard motion model that we were using for human tracking would already fail. And dogs would also move very unpredictably fast, right? And they could go under some obstacles and so on. And so this was one challenge. And at the same time, we were starting to talk to different national parks and people working in ecology about tracking animals. So the question came, how can we track animals? And why this question of tracking animals is important, I want to describe in a moment now. So the goal of this project Wildcat is to infer the animal behavior at scale. And by behavior, I mean not only primitive motion behaviors like walking, running, or drinking, eating, and so on, but also complex behaviors like interacting with other individuals, or grooming, and so on. And by doing this, by inferring animal behavior at scale, we aim to uncover, or the ecologists would aim to uncover, the changes or the impact of the changes in the environment and how it impacts various species and to what extent. And this, to infer the animal behavior at scale, we will then need autonomous monitoring systems or tracking methods for animals that can span very large areas and function continuously over long durations. So this brings in new challenges, right? And what are these challenges? So I'm already talking about this scale issue in the last 1 minute a lot, and this is exactly the big challenge: the scale of space and scale of time. So our solution in this wildcat problem is to develop a team of aided robots. Again, we're talking about aided robots that can cooperatively perceive the environment, the various animals that are there in the environment, their trajectories, and most importantly, their behavior, right? And in doing so, they must navigate as a perception-driven formation, tracking individuals. And to expand the space and time scale of monitoring, our approach is to use autonomous airships. So one is a systems level solution, because airships provide long longevity over multi-rotor drones. That's clear. It can hover without spending much energy. And also for the same amount of energy, it can travel longer distances. Although we have not proved this empirically, this has been seen already in previous works. And as part of this area fleet, so we want to include these airships as a part, and along with UAVs, and in such a way that we have smaller UAVs that now can even deploy themselves and dock back on these airships. So we have this heterogeneous team that we want to make, and of airships and multi-rotor drones, so that they can continuously work for a long period of time. And eventually, these airships, the idea is to also have the possibility of having solar panels on top of them, which you can actually buy these days. So large airships with solar panels on top. So the whole surface is a kind of a solar cell made of solar cells. And so the drones can actually go back, recharge, and come and go deploy again, fly, perform monitoring at close range, and then when they deplete in the battery, go back. So it's kind of a relay system. And this can continuously work for a very long period of time, at least for a whole day. Okay, so let's go step by step to see what we have done in this project, how the methods that we talked about so far apply to this application. Okay, so the first step in this, so I'll paint these sketches green when I'm talking about those components so that it's easy to relate. And so the first thing is aerial robots. So we have not only, so the new area is not only the drones, but also the airships. And what we have done is to develop not only these multi-rotor drones that we have been doing, but also several airships, right, which are fully autonomous, so have their onboard compute and sensing. And we have developed them in our lab, but we have already deployed them in, for example, the Hortobágy National Park in Hungary. And multi-rotor drones we have all deployed in the Impala Conservancy in Kenya. So what you see in the picture up there is Hortobágy on top, and on the bottom left is Impala National Park, Impala Conservancy in Kenya. Okay, so in this context, what is the next problem, right? So um, when we talk about extending our perception-driven formation control work to the team of airships, the first thing is that we need to have simulations and modeling frameworks for robotic airships and so on. So we have spent some effort on that to develop simulation framework for modeling and control of for airships. We have been developing PID-based controllers, reinforcement-based controllers. Not going too deep into that, but an important thing to highlight is that that we need to also extend the perception-driven formation control work to the team of airships, right? And this is not one-to-one transferable. Why? This is more challenging than multi-rotors because airships are slow, they are wind sensitive, they are non-holonomic, right? So their viewing direction and the motion direction are very tightly coupled. And therefore, we cannot simply say prescribe an optimal formation point and then expect the vehicle to go there. This outer loop control that we were doing in the multi-rotor case does not apply here. Instead, what we do is we reformulate the perception-driven formation objective into some airship feasible constraints. And what are these? For example, that when airships are moving in some orbital trajectories, these are kind of a motion primitive that is fixed to that airship, right? That is basically an inherent activity of the airship. So we take that as an airship feasible constraint, but then still apply some angular separation, distance guarantees, and so on that comes from previous work that I talked about, and subject centering and so on, and then solve these through an MPC-based controller. So basically, we respect the fact that for example, airships always keep orbiting instead of flying just along the target. They keep orbiting, but now we move the whole orbit in a certain way that it keeps all the target in the field of view. And in doing so, we also find out that the radius of the orbit around the target is now coupled with the speed of the target. And these kind of findings then we embed back into the MPC constraint to ensure that the target is always into the field of view. Okay, so once we have addressed the, let's say, control part or the high level control part of the problem, let's look at what are the perception tasks, right, in this in this project. There are many. And the first one is basically the 3D position tracking of the animals, which is one-to-one now translated, except for the motion model case, which by relaxing to constant acceleration and so on, to some extent, we can still apply our tracking methods that we have did. You'll see in some experiment results later. While the problem of a very arbitrarily moving target and very fast moving target or animals, this still remains an open problem. Although if you have very fast detectors, then you can reinitialize quickly once the target is lost. Okay, so what is the next perception problem? Without going into a lot of details about this, the 3D pose and shape is an important problem in animal tracking, because it gives a lot of hints, so a lot of hints into how the target or how the animal is behaving. So we can infer behavior from the pose and shape, and we can also infer the state of the animal's health from pose and shape, right? So the inferring pose and shape is a very important challenge, and we've been doing that through optimization-based methods where by pose and shape I meant here 3D pose and shape. So you have a skeletal pose and a mesh that describes the shape of the animal. And we've been looking at optimization-based methods, which is also typical in the literature, which is to use from VIT pose or some other pose get the 2D key points and then basically formulate an optimization problem to solve for some 3D pose parameters. So a prior distribution of the 3D pose hidden with some latent space parameterization is then used to reproject on what should be the expected 2D positions of these key points. And then you have the 2D key points from the actual measurements using VIT pose and so on. And then you have these error. And then you do least squares minimization to get what are the parameters of this the 3D pose basically distribution. So using this, we have been doing some pose and shape estimation. Some results you see here on the slide. Okay, then let's move on to the next perception problem, which is the behavior, individual behavior inference, right? So we just mentioned that what we can already do is to get behavior also from pose, which is kind of intuitive, right? So from a pose, you can infer what are the poses that basically could be classified as standing, could be classified as walking, and so on. Although some of it might need temporal information, some might not. So it could also be used for behavior inference, right? But we could do that. But for the first time, when we went to Kenya, so to get some data, deploy our drones and so on. This is a picture from Kenya, so from a drone that we took. We realized that due to many constraints, basically we have to be very far away from the animals, not to disturb them and so on. A close-up of an animal is typically very difficult. So how do you infer pose? That is already a difficult problem when you're very far away from the animal. And then from there, going to behavior is going to be even more difficult. So our solution, our idea was why not we estimate behavior directly from images or videos, right? So this turned out to be a practical way. And what we started to do was, of course, maintaining the use distances which are not very disruptive to the animals. We started to collect video data. So here is one of the videos that I collected, which was close enough to one of these herds of gravy zebras. But then comes the next problem. How do we annotate animal behavior, right? Once we have the video data, we want to learn directly from images the behavior. How do we annotate animal behavior, right? So simple behaviors are okay. Sometimes that is also not easy for Mechanical Turks to do because these behaviors need expert knowledge, right? And this is where the problem comes in. Once you need expert knowledge, you need time from real experts in ecology, which is basically very limited, right? So there is this one work that we did after collecting this data, which was how can we, so basically to develop a workflow, an end-to-end workflow that allows ecologists with very limited time to annotate very large volumes of data. And it turned out to be actually a lot faster, and some of them are already using it at Impala and Hortobagi now. So the idea is, although it looks a bit complicated here in this picture, but it's not so much complex. The idea is basically to bootstrap with a very small amount of very accurately labeled data, 100, 200 images with accurately labeled behavior and so on. Then we train a model on it, a classifier, basically, and use it on a next batch of data, and then ask the expert to correct the errors. And then this we iterate a few times, and then see it turns out that after a few iterations, 3 or 4 iterations, the number of corrections become less and less, and the expert needs to spend very little time to annotate all these videos from scratch, basically. Here is some results. Here are some results of our the model that was finally learned through this whole pipeline, which basically shows standing, running, walking, and grazing behaviors. And it is also important for these models to be highly accurate and not make frame by frame errors. Basically, even if there are some errors in some frames, it could jeopardize the later on analysis of activity budgets of the animals. So you'll see that in a video in a couple of videos later. And how that is important, how it is important that we don't have those gaps to understand basically animal decision making, right? And which animal is decided to do what. This has an impact on how the whole collective works and so on. Okay, so let's move on to the next item on the perception list, which is the individual recognition, and this is something that also is critical when we talk about, for example, multiple target tracking, right? So this is a point I did not even discuss before. We talked only about a single target in the environment, detection, tracking, etc. But when we have multiple, there are various ways you can disambiguate between detections of multiple targets. And one way is basically to have signature, right? So nature has already provided signatures to many species, but not so to other species in such a salient form, right? So at least for those species for which there is signature, we can do something, right? And we can get a signature from vision-based methods. Of course, people have been developing this for many, many years, but we always find some issues in those long-standing solutions. So there has been methods, deep learning-based methods already, which is a lot of in the last 10 years or so, which detect basically patterned animals. But one of the big problems with them is not detect, individually identify each individual. One of the big problems is that they're computationally heavy enough to be not able to run on a drone to be able to then use for multi-target tracking, right? So if we cannot do that in real time, basically it's useless. Even if you can do it offline, it has no impact when you are actually tracking and following using a drone, right? So this is one issue. And the second issue is basically most of them need to be, again, fine-tuned with new individuals or new kinds of species and so on, as is always the case with generalization of these models. But anyway, so one of my PhD students then took this problem up and said, okay, we go back to the old SIFT and features era and see if we can still use that and in some very fast way to basically start doing individual recognition in such fast ways that we can put it on a very small edge device and use it for multi-target tracking basically as a signature for in the detection measurement. So this paper just got published in Methods in Ecology.
The behavior of a
Can you hear the
individual
audio?
over months or even years?
Yeah.
Will you be able
Yes.
to recognize the same animal the next time you observe it?
I'll take a
This
moment and
challenge,
you can watch this.
recognizing the same individual across multiple observations, is known as re-identification or re-ID. It enables researchers to address key ecological questions, including population monitoring and tracking individual health and behavior. Numerous great tools already exist, but they are mainly suitable for static scenarios where neither fast ID prediction nor computational efficiency is a primary requirement. By contrast, in dynamic environments, such as autonomous monitoring systems, real-time decisions are essential and computational resources are limited. RAPID was developed to address this gap. Its name stands for Real-Time Animal Pattern Re-Identification on Edge Devices. Its ID prediction accuracy matches or even surpasses that of state-of-the-art tools. Evaluations across 3 hardware platforms using only CPU demonstrated substantially faster ID prediction, maintaining high efficiency even on resource-constrained edge devices such as drones. Results were obtained on highly diverse datasets, demonstrating robust performance across pattern types, camera systems, challenging imaging conditions, and varied viewpoints. RAPID is open source and easy to install and use on both Windows and Linux. It requires only a set of database images with known IDs and a query image set where IDs need to be predicted. These images should contain a single individual occupying most of the frame. Beyond being used as a standalone re-ID framework, RAPID's modular design enables seamless integration into diverse monitoring pipelines, as it does not include detection, cropping, or video frame selection components. This flexibility allows users to adapt RAPID to their preferred workflows without hard-coded constraints. At the heart of the algorithm, RAPID extracts SIF key points from query images and retrieves the most similar matches from a previously processed database. Fast query-to-database matching is enabled via MOI, an approximate nearest neighbor search algorithm developed by Spotify. Final identities are assigned by weighting retrieved IDs based on match frequency and key point similarity. And all this happens within a fraction of a second. Furthermore, predicted IDs are accompanied by a confidence score indicating prediction reliability and supporting downstream applications. While RAPID offers several key advantages, it also has limitations that may restrict its use in certain research scenarios. Overall, RAPID is a strong candidate for monitoring pipelines as a real-time resource-efficient re-identification module, as well as a standalone re-ID tool for image and video processing.
Okay, let's move to the next and the final set of videos that I have here for you, which describe basically our implementation of various methods and various perception methods, control methods, and so on in the wildcat demonstration scenarios. This volume is not needed so high. So the first case study is basically with the Przewalski's horses. So this is a video from Hortobágy National Park in Hungary, where we have deployed our airship in order to monitor wild horses. And again, what you see here is some of the solved problems that the airship can track and follow a single horse or at least a centroid of a horse formation. But we definitely cannot track multiple of these horses because they are not with salient features as zebras. Right. In Hungary, we have also deployed our multi-rotor drones, tracking individual horses, a single multi-rotor drone, the tracking and detecting and tracking, and also the cooperative active perception formation control that I talked about, tracking horses. Right. So that takes me to the next case study and the application of our methods where detection and tracking accompanied with the behavior inference then we put in the pipeline that we developed then for ecologists where they can get activity budgets. And this is what I was mentioning some slides before. You see at the bottom panel of this video, there is this activity budget which indicates how and individuals are basically changing behaviors. And by the way, here individual recognition is again important because you need to know which individual has what behavior so that eventually ecologists can answer questions how these animals are making decisions. So which animal decides when to move from one spot to the other, because of what reasons, whether the ground condition has changed, whether there is a threat from a predator, whether there is a noise, and so on. And the leadership question also can now be answered because it depends on which animal decides to move and how this information propagates to the whole group can also be now studied through this continuous observation and continuous inference of position, behavior, and so on. Okay, right. So next, what we show here is not only we are limited to single species, zebras or horses before. By the way, the wild horses that we are studying, I just forgot to mention, is an important point that is the only living wild horse species in the world, extremely endangered, and mostly only in the Hortobágy National Park. And in Impala, these experiments now we are doing with other species in Kenya elephants and giraffes. So here you see the result of the detection and tracking overlaid back on the drone video, similar to one of the videos in the beginning that I showed you with tracking humans from multiple UAVs. The point what you see here is that there are multiple individuals here, but we are tracking the one which is closest to the center of the image. And although we have multiple detections, we take the detection that is most likely associated to the current track, basically. Right. What we also show here again is not only that it works on different species with single drones, but also with multiple drones replicating the same multi-UAV human tracking experiment. Now we do it multi-UAV animal tracking experiment deployed on the system in Kenya. Okay, this kind of brings me close to the end of the lecture, and I want to keep the summary very brief. It was quite a long, almost 75 minutes. I hope most of the things you will remember. But yeah, just to summarize, what we went through was cooperative perception methods in multi-robot teams. And then how to use these perception of, outputs for active perception driven formation control methods, right? So first we perceive the target in some fused way from different robots in multi-robot team, and then we use this fused information to actively control and decide and actively make decisions on how robots should move in order to keep those perceptions optimal in some sense. And then we also saw very briefly how we move from multi-rotors to airships, and there are issues with formation control and so on that need to be addressed. And we saw some overview of different methods for aerial perception that we've been doing in the project Wildcap. And then finally, how these applications, basically the animal use case application in this case, using these methods and showing loopholes in the methods, and basically giving up rise to new challenges that then for which we have to develop new methods. Right. Okay. And then I will thank from my whole team also for all the work that, of course, without them, nothing is possible. We also have the code almost of everything openly available on our GitHub project page. And of course, most publications are also open access. Yeah, this concludes my talk and my lecture, and I'm happy to take questions.